I think I may have mentioned before that as a little kid I was a huge fan of the hit Broadway musical Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Anybody else grow up with that? My mom played us the soundtrack often and we would sing it around the house. It's much like what I would imagine kids today kids today experience Hamilton. I knew all the words to the songs by the time at the tender age of 2 I went to see it on Broadway. That might sound very glamorous, but we were living in New York at the time and probably got our tickets from TKTS. It was a short commute. And I loved that experience right up until the moment that I was unceremoniously ejected from the theater by an usher for singing too loudly. Apparently the other people did not come to see Liz Leavitt in the part of Joseph, or Liz Smith at the time. And I do cherish those memories, but I also think that the dulcet tones of some of those hit songs shielded me from a lot of the more troubling elements of this biblical story. I mean, when you think about it, it's actually a pretty dreadful and scary tale, with things at play such as sibling rivalry, yes, but also polygamy and slavery and violence and empire and drought and famine and grief. You remember the story, right? And I thought, of course they do, but sometimes it's nice to revisit a story from our past. So I just want to summarize it again here for you. This is Genesis during the patriarch building bit of the biblical narrative. Favorite son of his father's favorite wife, there were 4. Joseph is one of 12 brothers, among which his favored status is the cause of great jealousy and consternation. On top of that, his tendency to dream and his skill as a dream interpreter doesn't help, especially when Joseph dreams consistently that his brothers are destined to become subservient to him at some unspecified future point. Eventually, the brothers get so angry that they agree that the best thing to do is to kill Joseph. And they make a plan to do that, and they're about to do that until his eldest brother intervenes, and they decide, kindly is the implication, to sell him into slavery instead. And so Joseph becomes a slave, and the brothers go home and tell their father that he has been killed. Joseph ends up down in Egypt in the service of a wealthy Egyptian woman, which is going really well until she makes some advances on him, and her husband finds out about it and throws Joseph in jail. But Joseph makes some friends on the inside. A butler who, again, through dreams, Joseph predicts will return to Pharaoh's service, and a baker whose dreams mean he will be executed. Joseph's prophecies both come to pass. And a while later, when the Pharaoh ends up having dreams no one can interpret, the butler remembers his old buddy from lockup and introduces Joseph to Pharaoh. And Joseph tells Pharaoh that the dreams about fat and skinny cattle indicate a forthcoming time of abundant harvest, followed by 7 years of famine. And because apparently in ancient Egypt there was absolutely no stigma about being formerly incarcerated, Pharaoh immediately hires Joseph to manage the creation of the new food storage initiative, where the abundance of good times would be stored up for the difficult days ahead. And everything unfolds just as Joseph predicts, and when the famine comes, Egypt has food enough for themselves, and even some to spare, and sell to suffering neighbors, of which Joseph's brothers are some. And they come down south in search of food, and Joseph sees them and is sent into a torrent of emotions, understandably. I find this to be such a critical moment in the story, and as with so many biblical tales, I long for just a few more details here. You know, as it's written, there's no indication about whether Joseph was still thinking about his brothers or his father. But then there they are, right in front of him. And though this story is always cast at being about forgiveness, we should remember that in the middle of it, Joseph tortures his brothers for quite a time. He accuses them of being spies and liars. He throws them in jail. He plants evidence on them, on their persons, and then sends his henchmen out to accuse them of crime. He sends them home to retrieve their youngest brother, Benjamin, whom their father is reticent to let out of his sight because he is still so aggrieved by what he believes to be the death of his first son, Joseph. So here's this broken, grieving father and these guilty sons and this innocent brother and this scapegoat turned aggressor, and they're all motivated by the very real fact that their families are starving and that the earth will bring forth nothing to feed them. I mean, it's pretty bleak. And it's at this point, if you're reading the non-Broadway version, that you realize that the dreams that Joseph keeps having and interpreting throughout his life, they all come true. Except that they aren't really dreams, are they? They're almost all nightmares. Have you ever thought about that? Almost every one of them is a nightmare. He dreams that he will lord power over his brothers. He dreams that his friend will be executed. He dreams that the land will be barren for almost a decade. And it all comes true. And then, in the midst of all this, there are his brothers, his tormentors, whom he clearly never expected to see again, and they bring him the worst news of all. This famine, which Joseph had worked so hard to protect himself and his new people against, it struck his old homeland as well. And his father and his brother, the only ones he's ever loved, they're starving now too. Joseph's rise to power, his miraculous escape from the hell into which his brothers sent him, it is enough. There is still suffering for those he loves and now can't leave behind. In response to this, Joseph screams so loud that it echoes through the entire royal complex. Did you catch that? From the slaves in his own house over to all of the servants in Pharaoh's house. And you can imagine that that's what he does because his heart must be so full with so many things, with rage and sadness and worry and vengefulness and relief and fear, and deep down probably also with love. This is his family, and they are suffering. And I would imagine, if I'm allowed to imagine, that it's in that moment, and not before, but in that moment, that Joseph realizes that the thing he has to do to save his father and Benjamin is the hardest thing he's had to do yet, and that is forgive his brothers. I don't think we get a sense until that actual moment in the story that that is what he's going to choose to do. I think if we are not looking at this through rose-colored opera glasses, we see that this is not an easy undertaking for Joseph. It's not like a, hey, you sold me into slavery and faked my death and ruined my life and separated me from my family forever, but bygones. It's painful for Joseph, right? Hence all the screaming. And yet I think he comes to a realization that none of his plan will work without them. And so he screams and he cries and he yells and then he comes out of hiding and he embraces his brothers. And the truth is that they can't believe it. There's also kind of a sense that Joseph himself can't believe it. And they work out this plan to bring Jacob and all his tribe down to Egypt to reunite father with son and to settle in this place of abundance, which is a happy ending, sort of, unless you've ever read any of Exodus. Even this coming toward Joseph is tinged with sorrow if you know what happens to the descendants of those first transplants. It's a difficult story. It's a lot rougher than the musical, it turns out. But maybe that also means it can be more useful to us because it provides one version of the biblical answer to the question, what do we do when all of our worst dreams come true? What do we do when our fears become realized, which does sometimes happen? Sometimes really tough stuff happens in our lives. The people we love betray us, or they get sick and need our care, or we get sick and need theirs. Our friends and family die and leave us alone. Our circumstances change unpredictably, leaving us without resources to support. Our environment punishes us in real ways, presenting challenges to which we must adapt or perish. I've been thinking about that a lot this week. So we sweated out through the heat wave. I can remember with such clarity how in my childhood there was this huge focus on the ozone. Does anybody remember the ozone? Like, whoa, better stop using that Aquanet hairspray. It's killing the ozone. Like, whoa, someone threw a Coke can away. We better fish it out of the trash and recycle it because of the ozone. Now, it turned out the ozone wasn't the big thing, and that what we needed was more than recycled cans, but rather a total and complete overhaul of our energy system, its related economy, and our systems of consumption. But that's neither here nor there. The worst dream of scientists at that time was a warming planet. They talked about rising temperatures. Talked about more severe storms. They talked about polar bears getting stranded and food chains getting disruptive and massive migrations of people spurred to movement by heat. And as we live further into this new millennium, all those nightmares are coming true. It was 108 degrees in Portland last week. Hawaii is burning. There is about to be a hurricane in Palm Springs, California. It's happening. And the question is, what do we do? And what do we do as people of faith for this or for whatever else ails us? And maybe by some kind of way, Joseph can be a guide for us here, since that was his question too. And I think that's the case, then what we do first is actually allow ourselves to feel the emotion of it. Now we should acknowledge there are huge cultural forces and religious ideals at play that push us away from expressing or even feeling our negative emotions. Maybe that's like a whole nother sermon for another time. But it's true that we, especially here in the United States, have a deep-seated aversion to expressing difficult emotions like sadness, fear, or shame. We're taught from a young age that the best thing to do is look on the bright side. That we should think positive, right? Don't complain because it won't do any good. Yet I hear when my imagination the echo of Joseph's screams through that temple complex, and it tells me that part of the journey through any difficult thing is to allow ourselves to feel what we feel about it. Now maybe that is behind closed doors, or maybe it's in the company of a few good friends, maybe it's with our church community, but to allow ourselves to feel the feelings that our circumstances bring up in us. Think on them, to name them if we dare, and to be real about where and how we are. I'll give you an example. Last week when we were moving through all the heat, I felt obviously hot, but I also felt strangely fearful. I felt this feeling deep down, like, is this the beginning of what's to come? Does anybody else feel like that? Like, is this now the new normal? How will we cope as we go forward? I felt worry about the world our kids will inhabit. All of a sudden there were images come to my mind of these dystopian movies, right, where everyone just moves through the world as a scavenger. I worried, will it be as harsh as scientists suggest it might? Will my kids still be able to have flourishing lives and meaningful work? Will they eat delicious foods and know the taste of an Oregon strawberry? Will they take in beautiful landscapes? I felt the sadness of that potential loss. I also felt a little bit guilty for the ways that my privilege already insulates me from experiencing the brunt of these circumstances. How I was able to retreat into my house and crank up the window units while others felt the full force of the heat in hot trailers and tents throughout the city while I did little to help them. I also felt sort of angry at those who came before and didn't heed the warnings that have been out there for decades, those who were in power and didn't change the course of things on our behalf. I felt all that. And I imagine I may continue to feel that way. And I think it's important to say that out loud. This is scary stuff. We might be prompted to say, well, that was last week, and now it's only 83. But I think on a very deep level, it's unsettling to think that the planet on which we rely for existence is becoming less hospitable. I think that is taking up some part of our subconscious at all times. And I just hope we can make space for that. So I'm with Joseph. While he's screaming in the palace, right? But then I kind of did that, and I think that's important. But once we've done that, or as we alongside doing that, I think this is also important. Another lead I get from his story is to sort of stop and look around and consider how my current position, whatever it is, can be a springboard for compassion and action. Like once I've come to terms with how I feel, then I can consider, what am I actually able to do about this? What am I capable of as me in this moment, in this situation? Where am I? What skills or resources do I have at hand to deploy? Not what do I wish I had, or how do I wish things had gone, and where do I wish I would be, but what do I actually have that can be of service to this situation? What does the church have? We got a lot of stuff. Let's look around. And though I take issue with the suggestion in Genesis that God intended for Joseph to be sold into slavery so he could go through all of his trauma just to be there at the right moment and provide for his family, that's one theological interpretation, I do believe that sometimes our suffering ends up delivering us to a place that allows us to be a resource for others. Not that God sends us there, but that the Spirit, at work with us wherever we are, makes of that destination a blessing. And I think an honest assessment of what we have at our disposal is an important part of our ongoing co-working with God. And I also think this, here's a little bit of last bit that I take from Joseph's story. I think when we figure that out, we know how we feel, now what can I do about it? What do I have? I think in the moment when we figure that out, and in the very moment when we open our hands to give those things, be it forgiveness or hospitality or money or advocacy or care, in that very moment, when we open our arms to embrace what must be embraced, there seems to always be this small opening into which the Spirit moves. That's true throughout the biblical narrative, right? We open our arms, we open our hands, we respond to the summons to give what we have, and the Spirit shows up. The Spirit shows up. The things we know God to be about show up. Reconciliation and justice and peace and provision. That's where they swoop in, when we are open to giving what we have to the thing we're called to. And in the difficult times, I rely on that good news to help me find hope. Even in a situation where hope is slim, even in a situation where hurt has been done or emotions are running high, even in a situation where violence has occurred or forgiveness seems impossible, we hear again and again and again in the story of God's people that it's into those circumstances that we, through our generosity, service, and love, make space for God's reign to steal in. And so we keep on, and we make that space, and we welcome emotion, and we give from what we have. And we know in that way that the holy story keeps going just as it did in Joseph's time, just as it did in the time of the Exodus and of the liberation, and still on down and on down, on down to us who still await this moment of grace and wonder and surprise. And so I give all those invitations and that story and ask that God bless our understanding of it. Amen. We're going to respond in song. This again